Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Emsi webinars. We're really thrilled today. We have lots of people joining us for this exciting webinar. It's going to be very relevant, which is great. We have Will Cookson, the Director of Economic Development for Emsi, with us as our presenter, and also Duncan Brown, our Senior Economist. If you have any questions through the course of the webinar, please put them in the question box on your control panel, and we'll try and get to those at the end of the presentation. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to Will. Good morning, Will.
Good morning, Debbie, and good morning to everyone that's decided to stay indoors on this lovely sunny day in the UK. I just wanted to say this is the third in our COVID-19 webinars which have had an economic development focus. They're all available, or the first two are available either through our website or on our YouTube channel. So if you missed those, they may well be worth going back to. I wanted to obviously introduce Duncan Brown, our Senior Economist. He's going to be sharing his insight in regards to how impact can be measured using our input-output model. But without further ado, we'll move on and have a look at the agenda. We'll have our standing agenda item where we introduce Emsi. We'll do an update on the available insight in regards to COVID-19, looking at the available data. Then the meat of what we'll be covering today will be exploring the Emsi input-output model. We'll be looking at the impact, how that can measure impact in regards to sectors, and impact in regards to supply chains, and then we'll be going through where you can find out more through available resources. At Emsi, for those that don't know us, our mission is to help people make better decisions about the world of work. That's through us connecting and informing people directly, or through our work within the education sector or with employers. So the goals for this session, we've got three objectives. We'll give you an update on the available labour market information, with a particular focus obviously on the current crisis. We'll then be exploring Emsi's input-output model, how that can be used to support scenario planning, and then we'll point you towards further resources. So in terms of the labour market data that will be and is currently available, the big difference from last time is that claimant count unemployment data was released yesterday on the 19th of May, and you'll have seen that was all over the news, and that brings us up to the 9th of April. So that's the first claimant count data that we've had that falls into the lockdown period. And that's the first official indication of the impact in regards to occupations. But obviously that's far from a complete picture. And obviously the next release of claimant count data, which will be in June, will take us into up to the beginning of May. So we'll obviously have to wait for that. There are also, as we mentioned on our last webinar, special fortnightly business impact of coronavirus surveys, which cover turnover, workforce, prices and trade. Quite small but indicative, no regional or industry breakdowns on those. And then there's hard data on regional industry jobs, which unfortunately won't be available until September, which will be workforce jobs for Q2 or October. So there's that data lag in regards to the hard data, which brings us on to what we're currently using. Obviously, if you've been on previous webinars, we've spent a lot of time talking about job postings data and how important that is in terms of understanding the initial impact by looking at recruitment activity. And then the challenge with job postings, obviously, and we've talked about this previously, it is quite noisy. And small changes in posting practices can create weird effects. But nothing else at the moment obviously with the claimant count data, we do get a bit of this, but nothing else has had the local occupation rich detail. And obviously we can look directly at what employers' activities are, which is a great indicator in regards to where the impact will be felt at an occupation levels. We'll have more demand side data once those workforce jobs data set is released in late September. So not a huge amount of change since our last webinar in April, the big change being obviously the claimant count data. Thought it would be useful to just share a bit of insight in regards to where we are across the UK. This graph that we're looking at here illustrates the continued downturn in job postings, which mainly occurred by a large reduction in new postings. And you can see there the red line that we're following through is the net change. And you can see there was a big drain there in mid-April. And obviously, as long as that red line remains in the green, even though it's come back up, it continues to mean that there's been a huge reduction in postings. The other thing that we can see here is that obviously the reduction is because new postings aren't materializing rather than an acceleration in removing old postings. What's interesting is when we look at job postings, you can see that there's a huge variation by industry. I mean, we'd probably expect this to be the case. On the far left there, you can see a real outlier in terms of impact will be the hospitality sector, which has been worst hit in terms of job postings activity. Again, not a huge surprise, but then you can see as well that education has been the least impacted, and health and social care there in the middle has also not had the same impact. Again, those are things that we would expect. And then over on the far right, you can see there's been a large impact in regards to retail, and that's retail in the broadest sense as well. So that would include repair of motor vehicles and motorcycles, which obviously is going to be impacted by the fact there's been a lot less people on the road. And then unemployment. Again, as I said earlier, this has been all over the news. Obviously, you can see here, I think this is the largest month-on-month change that has happened since records began in 1971. It rose to 2.1 million in April. That's a 70% increase, and it's the highest unemployment figures since 1996. So really is unprecedented. And obviously this is the start, and we'll start to see how that impact rolls into May when we get the June release, which I think comes out around the 14th of June. So thinking ahead to recovery, I thought it'd be useful just to summarize what we've seen so far and really lead into what Duncan's going to take us through in regards to the input-output model and understanding the impact, but also the exposure with an eye on recovery itself. Industries are responding in different ways. We saw that in the job postings data. We know that anyway, anecdotally, through what we're seeing in the news. Even when not exposed, supply chains matter intensely. For example, your business might be fine, but the business that you supply to may be closed down. Therefore, the impact is going to be significant on you, even though you could continue to work and trade as normal. The flip side of that is obviously you could be dependent, your business could be open and serving customers, but you're dependent on suppliers that have been disrupted. They may have diverted their attention to making PPE materials, for example. The other thing that's worth mentioning is that turning off bits of the economy has multiplier effects. So there'll be indirect and direct effects that we'll be exploring as we look at the input-output model in a minute. And then the final point is that what we need to really understand is what will have the biggest impact. So we need to understand the negative and the positives in regards to the potential impact of this crisis, and they won't all be negative. And to be able to understand that, I think that segues us nicely into what we're going to be discussing around and exploring in regards to Emsi's input-output model. It is worth saying this isn't anything new. The input-output model has been available in our analyst tool for a long time. It's just that with the current crisis and the need to be able to scenario plan and understand different impacts of the crisis at an industry level and through supply chains, it seems to really come into our own, which I think, Duncan, you'll agree, that was a bit of a surprise to us in many ways.
Well, yes, just as the whole thing has been, really, as the claimant count chart there showed. It's kind of the sort of the nature of the shock. I mean, it's interesting when you compare that sort of rising claimant count to the 2008-9 recession, which of course was caused by what seemed like a sort of an unprecedented financial crisis, and with huge implications. But normally unemployment actually is a trailing indicator of economic shock. So often recessions hit the sort of the GDP figures harder first, and then that starts to filter through into unemployment. And that's also why normally it takes a while once you're out of a recession before unemployment really picks up. And you saw that in the early 90s, you saw that in the early 2010s as well. So it's kind of the shock nature of that. And going right back to the beginning, part of the issue we've got with that speed of change is that it'll be some time before we get hard data on what's going on in terms of regional economies and the mix of industries and so on. And so having tools like the IO model available to help us think through what we do know, what intelligence we do have about, that we can look at job postings and claimant counts, and then we have other intelligence about, say, what kind of industries rely on the public being in physical proximity with them. All these things you can mix in to start to say, well, what are the scenarios we should be considering about to think about what impact this is having, but also where can we find that leverage in terms of promoting recovery? What are the sort of the pinch points that if we can ease those kind of economic distresses, we can actually see some improvement. So really, we're going to just talk through it as a tool today, and just sort of what it involves. Because I think one of the things is, you said it's within our analyst tool, but actually not many other customers actively use it because it's potentially a bit kind of intimidating. And so trying to sort of clarify what it can do, because it's actually a very capable tool. This is specified down to local level with detailed industries, so it's a pretty powerful one. But let's go into it anyway. Let's before I waffle myself into whatever waffling would do. I think go on.
Your enthusiasm's contagious, Duncan.
Let's
keep that there.
Always. So as it says there, input-output analysis isn't new. Vasily Leontiev, who passed away in 1999 at the ripe old age of 93, was doing this back in the 20s, and he got his Nobel Prize for Economics, which isn't a proper Nobel Prize, I'll just say that there, in the 60s, but it was really for work he did back in the 20s on input-output analysis. And this is really influential. It's kind of one of the things that sort of creates the building blocks of a lot of our thinking about industry analysis and later macroeconomics. I mean, if it wasn't for inputs and outputs, then we wouldn't have had national accounting that gives us GDP figures and so on. So it was really important, and it's really about building on the supply chain relationships between industries, because what we realize is that every good and service that's produced somewhere has to be bought somewhere, because otherwise it wouldn't be produced. And so thinking about the web of interactions that creates, because it's easy to think about, if you think about a very pared down sort of economic model, you would say there are businesses and they produce goods which customers buy. but actually customers don't buy a lot of goods. There are lots of raw materials that are produced that customers, I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm not buying a lot of raw iron these days. So, understanding this kind of web of interaction through the economy becomes really important. One thing to just mention before we go on is that models built off of input-output analysis are what's called partial equilibrium only, which is economists speak for saying that they assume a fixed structure within the economy, and in particular about prices and wages. So what actually happens with long-run changes is, say you dumped hundreds of thousands of programmers out of work, and if there are any programmers listening, I'm not picking on you, I just needed an example that wasn't too emotional. What will happen then is that, if lots of computer businesses close down, there'll be these ripple effects through the economy, all these programmers will be made unemployed. But what would actually happen is that the wage that's paid for programmers would fall over time, and other businesses that could actually use programming skills if they were cheaper will start to use them more, and so actually they would start to be absorbed elsewhere. So the IO models don't account for that aspect. They can be used at the heart of a model called computable general equilibrium models, which add that sort of price adjustment mechanism in, but they are useful for seeing those kind of sort of first round effects before prices and wages adjust, because that process does take some time. So let's go on to the next slide. So really, when we talk about input-output analysis, at the heart of it is a matrix that's a bit like this. This is a relatively simplified version. And so every industry can buy or sell with another industry. And so on the left-hand side, you have inputs. So these are where industries are supplying their goods and services. And then on the vertical side, we have these industries appearing as outputs where they're being used. So basically, all of the columns along the top are parts of the economy that will buy goods and services from the left-hand side. So agriculture might be selling cereals, say, to manufacturers to make breakfast cereal with. Then manufacturers might then sell that to households, because you can see households there on the right-hand side, and exports, or they might sell them to foreign customers, which would be exports. And then on the bottom side, you've got this sort of the taxes and subsidies, because that's another flow of money through the economy as well. And you can use that to generate an estimate of GVA, because obviously the outputs that businesses create, taking away their inputs represents the value added as well. So you can see how this matrix is the kind of the raw underpinnings of an economy, snapshotted at one particular moment. And this is where the price and wages point comes in, that obviously that allows an additional flexibility within the model. But ultimately, it's about a sort of an accounting matrix that says, well, if businesses are producing something, then it has to be consumed somewhere. And so understanding that web of interactions is really critical. So go on to the next one, please. So in our model, we've got three sort of raw quantities that you can work with: jobs, sales, and wages. We concentrate on jobs for most of the discussion here, but we have estimates of sales, because we have to understand the sort of the buying and selling relationship, and it's actually sales values that matter in terms of what businesses and consumers spend on different goods and services. And obviously wages, because we have occupational data about sort of the mix of wages within industries. If we've got jobs and average wages, we can start to say, well, what's the sort of the associated wages that go with different job values? And then another thing that's worth considering is imports and exports. So normally when we talk about imports and exports, we talk about them at national level, and we're really concentrating on the physical act of goods leaving the country. We think about cars on container ships going overseas, or a ship arriving full of agricultural stuff. Well, in the IO model, it's slightly different. For one thing, because we want to actually focus it on regional economies, we actually do it at a local level. And so we can actually look at imports and exports for a local economy. But also, one other thing that we do is that we focus much less on the physical act of importing and exporting, and much more on the flow of money. So we're actually more concerned about whether cash is being injected into the economy, which is an export, or is leaking out of the economy, which is an import. And this also clears up one of the strange things about imports and exports, because if you've got a university in your area or a tourist attraction, then actually what happens is your customers come to you from outside of your area, including abroad, rather than the service going to them. So if you think about it, and of course there's not a lot going on at the moment with coronavirus, but if you think about a university with international students, that's an export because it's bringing in money from outside of the country, but actually the consumption takes place in the UK anyway. So the way that we use it here is much more economically informative in terms of looking at the sort of the where the money is going rather than where the customer is going. So if we go to the next one, so yeah, once you put all this together, it allows us to do a lot of work to understand regional economy. It's very data intensive, so we rely on what are called supply and use tables, which are the raw material to get the IO matrix, and they're published by the ONS, but it takes a while for them to be published in full. And there's also some other bits of data that we need to assemble around them. So it takes a while for the data to come through. That's why the most recent data in there is 2016. We do update it every year, but because it takes this kind of longer time to do it, that's why we have to have a few years lag. And that means that the GVA estimates that come from it are also lagged in that way, but it does allow us to give localized 4-digit industry estimates of GVA, which is more granular than you can get anywhere else. There's a lot of data that's in there. You know, when you think about that matrix for every local area, for every industry, it allows us to actually sort of look at the supply chain pattern between industries, you know, of all sorts in all areas. And so it's actually, you know, a huge amount of data that comes out of it, and the level of imports and exports for any given area. And we've got that in jobs, wages, and sales terms. And we can, as I mentioned before, use all that to add up and give an estimate of gross value added as well. So, you know, it's a great data resource there. So if you go on to the next slide. These are some of the reports that we have in Analyst, and I've just put there to really just sort of emphasize the range of data that's available there. So we'll cover the one at the top left, the input-output scenario, in a bit more detail in a moment. That allows you to do a what-if scenario, to say, well, if I changed industries in some way, so if I take 1,000 jobs out of industry X in a local area, well, what's the consequences of that? What are the ripple effects and the multiplier effects that go through there? Then we've got the sort of the aggregates of jobs, wages, and sales that are based on the model. So this is the kind of the stationary state. What does it look like? And then we've got these other ones that are about supply chain. So industry supply chain says, you know, you specify an industry in a local area, and it will tell you what purchases that industry makes from all the other industries in the economy. So it allows you to trace through what are the dependencies that it's got. The regional requirements does that the other way and says, well, within an area, how much is being spent on every single industry, and then how much of that is being met locally as opposed to outside the region, so how much is being imported. Regional multipliers say, well, if we changed jobs, wages, or sales by a unit, you know, be it 1,000 jobs or whatever, what's the multiplier effect? So, yeah, if I take 1,000 jobs out of this industry, will there be 1,400 jobs fewer? Say, well, that's a multiplier of 1.4. And then the exports table says, well, you look at what the amount of sales that's being produced by every industry, and then say, well, how much is being bought locally? Well, how much is left over that's being exported elsewhere? So these are all available for every local area, for every industry in the local economy. So if we go on to the next one. So just to motivate us a bit, to come back to the points that Will was making, we know that there are big changes going on in the economy, and there will continue to be big changes in the months ahead. We know, for example, that even as lockdown is eased somewhat, industries that have a lot of involvement with the public are going to struggle to get back on their feet. So what I've done here is I've plotted the percentage change in job postings since February to the most recent month, to just give a standardized measure for every industry grouping of occupations. And then on the x-axis, I've used this proximity to others measure that the ONS released for industry for occupations the other day, which measures how much time you have to be spending at work dealing with other people in physical proximity. So it's a good measure of how exposed you are to potential contagion risk, and therefore how much social distancing will affect you. And one of the interesting things is that industries with high proximity to others really split into two categories. So you've got the ones that are at the top there, education, human health and social work. So health and care, education, where you've got high proximity to others, but actually they're kind of essential services. You know, these are very much key worker areas, so they're not going to be switched off at all. And in fact, in health and care terms, we'd like to see increases in demand. And you can see that because job postings haven't really fallen that much there. And then you've got these ones down at the bottom in retail and accommodation and food services, so pubs, restaurants, hotels, which have high proximity to others but aren't key worker services. They're the ones that we can switch off, and that for as long as we have some degree of lockdown, certainly if we're in sort of alert level 4 and 3 and even 2 to some extent, these industries are really going to struggle. You know, while we're in 4, they've been closed down entirely in terms of pubs and restaurants. And so understanding these different industry effects is really important. You know, you've got this other massive industries there, which to varying extents will be able to have some recovery as you switch off some of the lockdown measures. But understanding those variations is going to become really important. And so if you move ahead, Will, what we can then do is say, well, we want to run a what-if scenario. And so this is that input-output scenario that you saw at the top left a moment ago. And so what we have to do is define the geography. And for this, we have to use a sort of a functional economic area, you know, sort of like a travel to work area, something like that. You can build your own out of the local authorities within the tool. That's no problem. But really, that's because, you know, the sort of the relationships tend to go within certain areas. And then you need to model the base data by industry and say, well, what's the effect that you're looking to model? So pick some industries and identify the sort of the jobs and wages and sales that, you know, any one of those 3 measures that you're going to have an effect of. So we use jobs in this instance. And then you can also now pick the multiplier model. We've only just added this feature in because, as Will said, it's become a lot more relevant now. And so these are how we model the interactions between industries. And so there's 3 types that are in there. The default is what we call type Emsi, which is actually the most developed one. Type 1 is industry to industry focused. So it's very much about that supply chain effect. So if you change the number of jobs in industry X, then its purchases from industries will change and their purchases from other industries will change. But then we just leave it there. Type 2 says, well, given the change in jobs that creates, that means there's going to be more or less income in the economy, so more or less final demand for products as well. So that's going to add an extra effect. And then type Emsi adds in certain investment effects, because obviously as you do those changes, you might see a change in investment activity, and that will have industry effects as well. So all of those are different, useful for different cases. Type 1 is especially useful for the sort of the national level analysis, because at national level, your issue is going to be that the import and export analysis becomes much less relevant than it is at regional level. And so it's much more of a self-contained economy relative to other things, because you've got the exchange rate to provide a relief valve there as well. But yeah, it allows some flexibility in how you're modeling things. So if we go on to the next one, we've got an example scenario. So here I picked Greater Manchester as an area. And what I modeled was 10,000 manufacturing jobs taken away from Greater Manchester. And by the way, multipliers are symmetric, so they go in both directions. So you can see on the left-hand side there, you've got the initial effect of those 10,000 jobs changed. Then you've got the direct effect, and I've got a slide explaining these, but I may as well explain that now, otherwise it won't make sense. So the direct effect is as manufacturing contracts by 10,000 jobs, in turn, manufacturers start to buy fewer raw materials, fewer services, and so on. And so that's the first round effect. And then there's a second round effect, which is indirectly. So say those manufacturers were buying a lot of raw steel, say, well, those steel companies were also buying lots of energy And so there's that indirect effect of the second round that comes in there. And then the induced effect is this effect of household changes. So as you know, these 13 or 14,000, well, about 13,000 jobs are lost, there's less disposable income in the economy, which means people are less able to buy those manufactured goods within the region. And so that adds that induced effect. And so you can see how here we've got a multiplier of 1.41 because 10,000 initial jobs lost results in 14,154. So, you know, understanding that sort of follow-on becomes really important to understand the full impact of changes. Going to the next one. And there's my very wonderful elaboration of all those effects, which I've already explained. As it says there, it is a snapshot analysis of impact, not over time. So it just says if for as long as this change happened, this is what it looks like. Obviously, some of those changes aren't constant. Obviously, prices and wages will adjust as well, and so that will lead to some adjustment back. But it does tell you about the initial kind of consequence of these changes. And so go to the next one, please. And what it also allows you to do is break down those effects in terms of individual industries. So here, I've picked out the top 10 four-digit industries from that change in manufacturing in Greater Manchester and said, well, what are the industry effects on other industries in terms of that direct, indirect and induced effect. And you can see that sort of retail sale has a huge consequence. There's a lot of things being bought there, but also the machining industry, repair and maintenance of aircraft and spacecraft, and then temporary employment there as well. And you can see the mix between things. So restaurants and mobile food services activity, very little catering things being purchased directly by the manufacturing industry, but a huge reduction from induced jobs being lost because people haven't got money to spend, so they don't go to restaurants and so on. So if we go on to the next one. So yeah, just to sum up, the model is a really powerful tool for economic analysis with massive flexibility. It can be specified down to local level. It can be specified for very particular groups of industries and can then really give you a lot of data back in terms of the supply chain relationships and so on. There's also that extensive detail on the transactional links which make up local economies. So rather than just looking at the Whatif scenario, you can look at what that supply chain looks like. But those impact scenarios do really allow you to start considering, well, if these early signs that we're seeing from job postings, from claimant count do follow through for effects on particular industries, what does that look like in terms of impact scenarios? So that's me done, I think.
Almost, Duncan. We have had some questions, yes, okay. As you'd imagine. But just firstly, yeah, thanks for sharing that. It's really informative and interesting. Yeah, I'm quite pleased to see input-output models having their day. But having it explained in that way is really beneficial to us within Emsi, and I'm sure our customers and people externally as well. Just picking up a few of the questions that we've had. Is there a comparison with the equivalent period for previous years on job postings? Yes, there is, and that's available within the tool, so we can look back month at the same period last year, month on month, or over. Yeah, that's the way in which we would show that. Yeah,
we've got data back to January 2016. So exactly. I mean, the one thing is that job postings data is generally quite noisy, but I mean, if you compare it to a year ago, it gives you a good indication of how much the change is. You know, job postings a year ago were similar to what they were in sort of February, March, and so it gives you a sense of how much of a change has been.
The next one is asking, furloughed staff can apply for universal credit. Do these individuals then count as unemployed within the claimant count data that we were talking about earlier on?
So yes, so claimant count now, and this causes all kinds of noise in there. It used to be that you could only get on it if you were claiming unemployment benefits or job seekers allowance and so on specifically, and a bunch of associated benefits, whereas now with universal credit it is much wider. So yeah, there is some element of that there. Most furloughing, I think, isn't resulting in that by the look of the numbers. I mean, if you look at the US increase in unemployment, it's much sharper. I mean, it's kind of, so ours is, yeah, if you take the claimant count sort of on its face, it suggests that our unemployment rate is probably going up sort of, you know, from the 4-5% level to sort of the 9% level, sort of, you near doubling. Whereas in the US, the unemployment insurance data suggests it's gone up more to sort of 20%, which suggests that furloughing is reducing quite significantly the level of movement onto unemployment, even though that there is that element of universal credit take up as well. What that means in the long run, of course, is that it is difficult to judge, because the hope is that furloughing will allow those people to return to their jobs, but it may be, of course, that it's suppressing unemployment, and that will come later. So we'll just have to see how that turns out. But yeah, so that's my attempt at an answer on that one.
No, that's really helpful. The next question we've got is it's asking, can we define the regions that we use for IO analysis?
Yeah,
I think that's over to you, Duncan, but essentially I think, yeah.
Yes, so you can do it using any combination of local authorities that you choose within the model. My recommendation is that you should use it with a group of local authorities that reflect a broad travel to work area. We have available, if anybody needs advice on that, a set of local authority maps to their nearest equivalent travel to work areas. So if anybody needs some guidance on what that looks like using the commuting data that's from the 2011 census, then we can give them some advice on that. So that's not a problem.
Okay, the next one is prefaced with us saying it may be a silly question. I don't think it is, having read it. It's asking, in regards to our multipliers, do they also account for increases in economic activity? So how good is the model for looking at the introduction of new technological and labour organisation processes that may have come about as a result of COVID-19?
So this is two questions really. Multipliers are effectively monotonic. They go in one way. So if you think about the way that it works, if you model a change in manufacturing jobs, say a 1,000 job reduction, then that will result in lower purchases of other industries. So on its face, it will do that. I should say, I think I mentioned earlier that multipliers are considered to be symmetrical. So if a 1,000 job increase in manufacturing will just be the same as a 1,000 decrease in manufacturing, just with the signs reversed. But it won't cover that. And so to the second part of the question, no, the model doesn't cover questions about the introduction of new technological and labour organisation processes. It's looking at, if you take the current state of transactions and the web of interactions between industries and you introduce a relatively simple change, what happens there? We do have other data that looks at questions of new technological practices, but those ones are much more difficult to model out in terms of their sort of short run impact, and we keep the IO model relatively straightforward in that sense.
Okay, last question, I think, or maybe there's a few more that have arrived. No, this is the last one. We've talked about retail jobs going down, but for supermarket industries, is there not a large increase in job roles? Have your stats on this compare? How do our stats on this compare to education and health and social care? I mean, there's a point I tried to make clear, but may need some more clarity. And Duncan, you may want to help with this. But when we're looking at retail at that level, we're looking at retail that includes a whole range of activities, including, for example, garages, wholesale of cars, and so on and so forth. So it's not just looking at supermarkets at that level. But we can do that.
There's two dimensions to this really. So with job postings data, it's built on occupational basis. So the industries are groups of occupations in this case. But there's two reasons why. Well, there's one reason why it will be lower, and another reason why it might be underestimating areas of growth. The reason why it will be lower is, as you say, that there's lots of areas of retail that really are in trouble. So, car dealerships are essentially sort of closed, or certainly have been until relatively recently. All of your kind of high street shops, your kind of your clothes shops and department stores and so on. So that all of the non-supermarket retail is closed. Supermarkets are different. So supermarkets obviously have been actually under a lot of pressure to perform. There's a reason why that might be underestimating the data, and I think that's highly likely, and that's about recruitment strategy. So one thing is that they've probably gone to a lot of agencies to get a lot of staff, which might mean that there's less job posting activity. Another one is that job postings can only pick up the job postings that appear. If you put one job posting and you're actually hiring 100 staff, well, in job postings terms, it's just one job posting because we have no data. The job postings don't say how many people they're willing to hire. And so when you've got this situation where you've got bulk recruitment going on, job postings data can lead to an underestimate on that. So I agree that I think that the retail situation might look worse than it actually is. However, there is a large part of retail that will continue to struggle because, you know, if you go into your city centre shopping centre, most of those shops have been closed for a month or two now, and even with social distancing, they'll find it difficult, you know, after a lockdown to return to business normally because, you know, speaking for myself and my family, we sort of aren't itching to go back into a busy shopping centre until there's better news on the coronavirus, even if the lockdown ends. You know, it's one thing to go to a public park, it's another thing to go to a really concentrated shopping environment.
We had a "thank you, that makes sense now" response, which I think's a nice way to end the questions. Just wanted to mention a few things in terms of resources that are out there. Do look at our website, plenty of information being shared for our blog, everything from how data can continue to be used to help get a handle on local economies, and a big focus at the moment on the language of skills, which I'll come back to in regards to our next webinar. We still have the COVID-19 dashboard looking at the impact nationally, and there are obviously reports including the closing time, which looked at the shutting down of restaurants, cafes and pubs in regards to the understanding the initial impact of COVID-19. There are plenty of tools and expert help available. We have bespoke consulting reports and projects or projects that generate reports, and if you want to talk to us about those, do let us know. We have our analyst tool, which Duncan mentioned earlier on, which includes the IO model we've been looking at today. And the third column, which I seem to have lost, was basically saying that there are a number of freely available reports and resources that are available through our website. Oh, there they are, custom research reports. The next webinar is on the language of skills. So we're anticipating an increasing and intensifying of a pre-existing skills gap that was there. It has been there historically. It was already being brought into sharp focus by automation and by Brexit. In this webinar, which is on the 3rd of June at 2 p.m, we'll be exploring the new work that Emsi's been doing to develop the language of skills, which is a way of looking at skills to inform solutions that should help to bring a major breakthrough in regards to this complex issue. And obviously, I'm going to say, to find out more, do register through the website to the webinar or for the webinar. Debbie, do you want to mention about the national conference?
Yeah, well, the national conference was due in May, but obviously we reschedule it to the 13th of October. So hopefully you'll be able to join us. God willing, it will still go on, but if not, we will keep you informed. There is a cancellation of just 7 days. So if you do want to book, don't worry. If it is cancelled or if you need to cancel, then that can be sorted out for you. So it would be good to see you there. Obviously, it's very topical and it's going to be a great day. So yeah, just come along and it'll be great to see you. So thanks, Will.
Thank you. And I think that brings us to the end. So thank you for everyone that's joined us today. Do make contact if you have questions that occur to you as an afterthought, and do reach out to us if you'd like to find out more about the work we're doing in your areas. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.